The red sun of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the mining facility that served as one of the galaxy's most feared prisons. The planet's surface was covered in rust-colored rocks and deep canyons, where prisoners spent their days digging for rare minerals that powered alien starships. The air was thin and bitter, making every breath a struggle for the human inmates who were not built for this harsh world. Maria Santos pressed her face against the small window of her cell and watched the new prisoners being marched across the courtyard. Their orange uniforms were already dirty from the transport ship, and their faces showed the same fear and confusion she had felt 6 months ago when she first arrived. The Zephyrian guards moved like giant insects on their 6 legs, their blue skin gleaming under the alien sun as they herded the humans toward the processing center. The prison was built into the side of a massive cliff, with hundreds of cells carved into the rock face. Each level housed different types of prisoners, from petty thieves to political rebels. The humans were kept on the middle levels, sandwiched between the violent Krillian warriors above and the peaceful Andorian merchants below. It was a system designed to create tension and prevent any organized resistance. Maria had been a medic on Earth before the Zephyrian Consortium conquered her home planet. She had made the mistake of treating wounded resistance fighters in her clinic, and the aliens had labeled her a terrorist sympathizer. Now she spent her days working in the prison's factory, assembling components for mining equipment under the watchful eyes of armed guards. 3 levels above her, in the maximum security section, Joseph Running Bear sat in meditation on the floor of his reinforced cell. The quantum shackles around his wrists and ankles hummed with energy, sending small jolts of pain through his body whenever he moved too quickly. The aliens had marked him as extremely dangerous after he had killed 12 Zephyrian soldiers during Earth's final battle for freedom. Joseph was Apache, raised on stories of his ancestors who had fought against impossible odds to protect their people. His grandfather had taught him the old ways of healing and warfare, knowledge that had served him well during the human resistance. Now, at 35 years old, he found himself trapped in a cage of alien metal and energy, but his spirit remained unbroken. The daily routine in the prison was designed to break the will of even the strongest inmates. They were awakened before dawn by harsh alarms and given barely enough food to survive. Work shifts lasted 14 hours with only short breaks for water and rest. Medical care was non-existent unless a prisoner was too valuable to lose, and the guards seemed to enjoy watching the inmates suffer. Lisa Hartwell had arrived at the prison 2 weeks ago, heavily pregnant and scared. She was only 22 years old and had been accused of smuggling weapons to rebel groups on Mars. The evidence against her was weak, but the Zephyrian courts did not care about proof when it came to human defendants. Her husband had been killed in the arrest, and now she faced the prospect of giving birth in this terrible place. The other human prisoners had taken Lisa under their protection as much as possible. Maria had used her medical knowledge to check on the young woman whenever the guards were not watching. She estimated that Lisa had only a few weeks before the baby would come, and the thought of childbirth in these conditions filled her with dread. Captain Rodriguez had been the leader of a resistance cell before his capture. He was a career military officer who had refused to surrender even when Earth's government officially gave up the fight. His cell was next to Joseph's in the maximum security section, and the 2 men had developed a grudging respect for each other, despite their different backgrounds. The prison held over 3,000 inmates from dozens of different species, but the humans were treated worst of all. The Zephyrians viewed humanity as a particularly dangerous and unpredictable race that needed to be controlled through fear and suffering. They had studied human history and were impressed by humanity's capacity for both cruelty and heroism, which made them useful as workers, but dangerous as enemies. Amy was not yet born, but her mother Lisa carried her in the growing certainty that this child would enter a world of pain and bondage. Lisa spent her days in the textile workshop, sewing uniforms for other prisoners while trying to ignore the ache in her back and the fear in her heart. The other women tried to comfort her, but everyone knew that having a baby in this place was almost a death sentence. The Zephyrian Consortium had built this prison to serve multiple purposes. It was a source of cheap labor for their mining operations, a place to remove troublesome elements from conquered worlds, and a symbol of their power over lesser species. The guards were chosen for their cruelty rather than their competence, and they took pleasure in reminding the prisoners that they were completely powerless. Food was delivered twice a day through slots in the cell doors. The gray paste had all the nutrients needed to keep a prisoner alive, but tasted like dirt mixed with chemicals. Water was rationed carefully, and the showers were ice cold and lasted only 2 minutes. The cells were barely large enough for a person to lie down, with a simple toilet and a thin mattress that provided little comfort against the hard stone floor. At night, when the artificial lights dimmed to simulate darkness, the sounds of the prison became a symphony of misery. Prisoners cried out in their sleep. Some called for family members they would never see again, and others simply wept quietly in their cells. The guards walked the corridors in their heavy boots, occasionally stopping to torment an inmate who had caught their attention. Despite the harsh conditions, the human spirit proved difficult to crush completely. Prisoners found ways to communicate through tapping codes on the walls and passing messages during work shifts. They shared what little food they could spare and offered comfort to those who were breaking under the pressure. Small acts of kindness became precious treasures in a place designed to destroy hope. Maria often thought about her family back on Earth and wondered if they were still alive. The Zephyrians had promised that cooperation would lead to better treatment for human civilians, but she had learned not to trust anything the aliens said. Her only goal now was to survive long enough to return home someday, even though that dream seemed more impossible with each passing day. The prison represented everything that was wrong with the galactic order that the Zephyrians had imposed after their conquest of human space. It was a place where justice had no meaning, and mercy was seen as weakness. But it was also a place where the strength of the human spirit would soon be tested in ways that none of the inmates could imagine. The pain started during the night shift when Lisa was working in the textile factory. She had been sewing the same orange uniform for the past hour when the first contraction hit her like a lightning bolt. She doubled over her workstation, trying not to cry out and attract the attention of the Zephyrian supervisor who was already looking for reasons to punish the human workers. The alien guard noticed her distress anyway and approached with the swagger that all the prison staff seemed to share. His blue skin was marked with the scars that indicated his rank in the Zephyrian military, and his 4 eyes studied Lisa with the cold interest of a scientist examining an insect. When he spoke, his voice came through the translation device that all guards wore to communicate with different species. Lisa tried to explain that she was in labor, but the guard simply laughed with a sound like grinding metal. He told her that human reproduction was not his concern, and that she should continue working until her shift ended in 6 hours. When Lisa collapsed to her knees as another contraction ripped through her body, the guard used his shock stick to force her back to her feet. The other human workers watched helplessly as Lisa struggled through the next few hours. The contractions were coming faster now, and she could barely focus on her sewing. An older woman named Betty tried to help by taking some of Lisa's work, but the guards noticed and punished both women with reduced food rations for the next 3 days. When the shift finally ended, Lisa could barely walk back to her cell. The guard shoved her through the door and activated the energy barrier without any regard for her condition. She lay on her thin mattress, trying to breathe through the waves of pain that were getting stronger and closer together. She knew that Amy was coming whether the prison was ready or not. Maria Santos was 3 levels down in the medical wing of the prison, which was really just a storage room with some basic supplies. She had been treating a prisoner who had been beaten by guards when she heard through the communication network that Lisa was in labor. The news filled her with terror because she knew how dangerous childbirth could be even under the best conditions. The human prisoners had developed a system for passing messages through the ventilation shafts and the gaps in the stone walls. Word spread quickly that Lisa needed help, but everyone knew that the guards would never allow medical assistance. The Zephyrians had made it clear that human lives had no value beyond their ability to work in the mines and factories. Lisa's water broke at 3 a.m, and she knew that there was no stopping what was happening. She had attended childbirth classes back on Earth when she thought she would give birth in a proper hospital with doctors and nurses to help her. Now she was alone in a cold stone cell with nothing but fear and determination to guide her through. the most difficult experience of her life. The baby came faster than Lisa had expected. Amy entered the world screaming and covered in blood, a tiny human being taking her first breaths in the worst possible place. Lisa managed to clear the baby's airways and wrap her in the only clean piece of cloth she had, which was part of her own uniform. The sight of her daughter's face gave her strength she did not know she possessed, but something was wrong. Lisa could feel blood flowing from her body in amounts that scared her. She had heard about complications that could happen after childbirth, and she knew that without medical help she could die. The bleeding was getting worse and she was starting to feel dizzy and weak. Amy was crying, but Lisa was finding it harder to focus on anything except the growing pool of blood beneath her. 3 levels up, Joseph Running Bear felt the disturbance in the prison's energy field that told him something significant was happening. His Apache training had taught him to sense changes in his environment, and years of resistance fighting had sharpened those skills even further. He pressed his ear to the wall and listened to the faint sounds of a baby crying somewhere below him. The quantum shackles around Joseph's wrists sent jolts of pain through his arms whenever he moved, but he ignored the discomfort and focused on what he was hearing. Through the network of tapped messages that passed between the human prisoners, he learned that a baby had been born and that the mother was in serious trouble. The news stirred something deep in his warrior's heart that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with protecting the innocent. Maria was desperate to help but trapped by the prison's security systems. She had been trained to handle emergency childbirth situations during her medical studies, and she knew that Lisa was probably suffering from postpartum hemorrhage. Without immediate treatment, the young mother could bleed to death within hours. The thought of losing both mother and baby to the indifference of their captors filled her with rage and helplessness. The guards were aware that something had happened in Lisa's cell, but they showed no interest in investigating. Their orders were clear about not providing medical care to prisoners unless specifically authorized by their superiors. The night shift supervisor had already gone to sleep, and none of the guards wanted to wake him for something as unimportant as a human birth. Lisa held Amy close to her chest and tried to stay conscious. The baby had stopped crying and was now sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger they were both in. Lisa whispered promises to her daughter about the life they would have together someday, even though she could feel her own strength fading with each passing minute. The blood loss was making her thoughts fuzzy, and she knew she did not have much time left. In his maximum security cell, Joseph made a decision that would change everything. He had sworn an oath as a warrior to protect those who could not protect themselves, and that oath did not disappear just because he was imprisoned. The quantum shackles were designed to be unbreakable, but Joseph had learned during his time with the Resistance that alien technology always had weaknesses if you knew how to find them. The pain from the shackles was incredible, but Joseph had endured worse during his capture and interrogation. He began to test the limits of the restraints, feeling for any give in the metal or fluctuation in the energy field. His grandfather had taught him that every chain could be broken if you understood its nature, and Joseph was determined to prove that ancient wisdom correct. Captain Rodriguez heard the sounds of Joseph's struggle and tapped a warning message on the wall. He knew that attempting to escape from maximum security was almost certainly suicide, but he also understood the code that warriors lived by. If Joseph was willing to risk everything to save a mother and child he had never met, then Rodriguez would do whatever he could to help. The night stretched on with Lisa growing weaker and Joseph working methodically to find a weakness in his prison. Amy slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her survival now depended on the courage of an Apache warrior who refused to let another innocent person die while he had breath in his body. The final quantum shackle around Joseph's left ankle was the most difficult, because the energy field had been reinforced after detecting the failure of the other restraints. The prison's monitoring system was designed to compensate for partial escapes by strengthening the remaining bonds, but the aliens had not counted on someone who understood both ancient wisdom and modern technology. Joseph's body was screaming with pain from hours of precise manipulation and stress positioning. His muscles had cramped from maintaining unnatural poses while working on the shackles, and small electrical burns marked his skin where the quantum fields had punished his movements. But his mind remained clear and focused on the task ahead. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. reminding him that pain was temporary but failure could last forever. The strengthened shackle required a different approach. Joseph could feel that the power cell had increased its output and the energy field was now fluctuating in patterns designed to prevent the microfracture technique he had used on the others. The Zephyrian technology was adapting to his methods, but adaptation created new opportunities for someone who understood how to think like both predator and prey. Through the wall, Captain Rodriguez was tapping increasingly urgent updates about the morning guard schedule. The maximum security section would be inspected in less than 20 minutes, and any guard who found Joseph free from his restraints would immediately sound the alarm. The entire rescue mission would be over before it could begin, and Lisa would die while Joseph faced whatever new torments the aliens could devise. Joseph shifted his approach from trying to break the shackle to trying to understand it. He pressed his freed hand against the metal band around his ankle and felt the vibrations of the energy field as it pulsed with power. The pattern was complex but not random. The Zephyrians had programmed it to respond to different types of stress, but like all programs, it followed rules that could be learned and exploited. The key came when Joseph realized that the strengthened field was designed to prevent gradual damage but was actually more vulnerable to certain types of sudden shock. His ancestors had used a technique called the lightning strike, where all available force was concentrated into a single instant of maximum impact. The risk was enormous because failure would trigger every security system in the prison and probably kill him in the process. Joseph positioned himself carefully and began to gather his strength for the attempt. He thought about Lisa bleeding to death in her cell and her baby crying for help that only he could provide. He thought about his grandfather, who had escaped from a federal prison using nothing but courage and traditional knowledge. He thought about every Apache warrior who had ever faced impossible odds and chosen to fight anyway. The lightning strike technique required perfect timing and absolute commitment. Joseph had to channel all his remaining strength into a single moment while striking the exact pressure point where the energy field was anchored to the physical restraint. There would be no second chance because the shock from failure would leave him unconscious and helpless. Joseph took 3 deep breaths and let his mind become perfectly still. Time seemed to slow as he raised his free leg and brought his heel down with every ounce of force he could generate directly onto the shackle's power cell. The impact sent shockwaves through his entire body as the quantum field collapsed in a cascade of sparks and energy discharge that lit up his cell like a lightning storm. The explosion of feedback from the destroyed shackle triggered alarms throughout the maximum security section. Emergency lights began flashing and automated systems started sealing blast doors to prevent prisoner escapes. But Joseph was already moving, using the confusion of the moment to slip out of his cell through the maintenance hatch he had been studying for months. The maintenance tunnels that ran behind the cells were barely large enough for a human to crawl through, and they were filled with pipes and cables that carried power and life support throughout the prison. Joseph had memorized their layout by listening to the sounds of repair crews and tracking the vibrations of different systems. Now he used that knowledge to navigate toward the level where Lisa was dying. Behind him, guards were shouting in the Zephyrian language as they discovered his empty cell. The quantum shackles were supposed to be impossible to break, and their failure would bring investigators from the highest levels of the prison administration. But Joseph had bought himself a small window of time, while the guards tried to understand what had happened and organize their response. The maintenance tunnel sloped downward as it followed the natural contours of the rock cliff where the prison had been built. Joseph moved as quickly as he dared while trying to stay quiet enough to avoid detection. His body was exhausted from the hours of work on the shackles, but adrenaline and determination kept him moving through the narrow space. 2 levels down, Joseph encountered his first major obstacle. The tunnel was blocked by a security barrier that was designed to prevent exactly this type of escape attempt. The barrier was made of the same energy field technology as the shackles, but it was much more powerful and covered the entire width of the tunnel. Getting through it would require a different approach entirely. Joseph examined the barrier carefully and realized that it was powered by the same type of energy cell as the shackles. The Zephyrians used standardized technology throughout their facilities, which meant that techniques that worked on one system might work on others. But this barrier was much larger and more heavily defended than the personal restraints had been. The solution came from a lesson his grandfather had taught him about fighting larger enemies. When you cannot match an opponent's strength, you must find a way to use that strength against them. The energy barrier was powerful, but power required control systems that could be disrupted if you knew where to look. Joseph found the control junction where multiple power cables fed into the barrier generator. Using a piece of broken pipe from the tunnel, he created a short circuit that sent feedback through the entire system. The barrier flickered and weakened as safety systems tried to compensate for the electrical surge. In that moment of instability, Joseph lunged forward and passed through the disrupted energy field. The disruption triggered more alarms as the prison's security system detected unauthorized access to restricted areas. Joseph could hear boots running in the corridors as guards scrambled to respond to multiple simultaneous security breaches. But he was now only one level away from Lisa's cell, and nothing was going to stop him from completing his mission. The final stretch of tunnel led directly to the ventilation system that served the general population cells. Joseph could hear Amy crying somewhere ahead of him, and the sound gave him new strength despite his exhaustion. He was so close now that he could almost feel Lisa's pulse growing weaker with each passing minute. Joseph reached the ventilation grate that opened into the corridor outside Lisa's cell, just as the emergency lockdown protocols activated throughout the prison. Blast doors were slamming shut and security barriers were powering up to trap any escaping prisoners. But Joseph had timed his escape perfectly, and he was already where he needed to be. The ventilation grate was secured with simple bolts that Joseph could remove using the piece of pipe he had kept from the tunnel. As he worked on the fasteners, he could hear guards shouting orders and running through nearby corridors. They were searching for him in all the wrong places while he prepared to drop down directly into the area they thought was secure. The grate fell away, and Joseph lowered himself into the corridor outside Lisa's cell. The energy barrier that kept her imprisoned was glowing with the same blue light as the shackles he had just destroyed. But this barrier was different, because it was designed to keep people in rather than to punish them for trying to escape. That difference would make all the difference in what happened next. Joseph Running Bear closed his eyes and listened to the sounds that traveled through the stone walls of the prison. The building was old and had been carved from the living rock of the planet, which created natural channels that carried sound in unexpected ways. Through these ancient pathways, he could hear the faint crying of a baby and the even fainter sounds of a woman in distress 3 levels below. His grandfather had told him stories about Apache warriors who could sense danger from miles away and hear the whispered prayers of their people across vast distances. Joseph had always thought those were just legends until his time in the resistance taught him that human senses could be sharpened far beyond what most people believed possible. Now, trapped in quantum shackles that sent lightning through his nerves with every movement, he was grateful for those gifts. The shackles were a masterpiece of Zephyrian technology. They created an energy field that surrounded the prisoner's wrists and ankles, making any sudden movement extremely painful while preventing the wearer from breaking free through brute force. The aliens had tested them on hundreds of different species and believed they were completely escape-proof. They had never tested them on an Apache warrior who carried the wisdom of generations in his blood. Joseph's great-grandfather had been imprisoned by the United States Army in the late 1800s and had escaped from a federal prison using nothing but patience and traditional knowledge. The story had been passed down through the family, along with the techniques that made such escapes possible. Joseph had learned those same skills as a child, practicing them as games without understanding that someday they might save his life. The first step was to understand the enemy. Joseph had been studying the quantum shackles for months, noting how they responded to different types of movement and stress. The Zephyrians had designed them to punish resistance, but had not considered that someone might use the pain as a tool, rather than trying to avoid it. Pain was information, and information could be turned into power if you knew how to use it. Through the communication network that connected the human prisoners, Joseph received updates on Lisa's condition. Maria Santos was providing medical guidance from her cell in the medical wing, describing the symptoms of postpartum hemorrhage and explaining what needed to be done to save the young mother's life. The message was clear. Lisa would die within hours without immediate intervention. Joseph began his meditation, drawing on techniques that his ancestors had used to prepare for battle and survive torture. He slowed his breathing and heart rate while focusing his mind on the task ahead. The quantum shackles responded to stress and movement, but they could not read thoughts or intentions. If he could remain calm enough, he might be able to find the weakness he needed. The energy field around each shackle was generated by a small power cell that drew energy from the prisoner's own bioelectric field. It was an elegant solution that meant the restraints never needed to be recharged or maintained. But Joseph had noticed small fluctuations in the field strength that seemed to correspond with his physical condition and emotional state. When he was exhausted or extremely calm, the field weakened slightly. Captain Rodriguez was tapping messages of encouragement through the wall, but Joseph barely heard them. His entire focus was now directed toward the microscopic examination of his restraints. Through touch and observation, he could feel the slight variations in temperature around the power cells and sense the tiny vibrations that indicated stress points in the metal components. The breakthrough came when Joseph remembered something his grandfather had taught him about pressure points in the human body. Every system, whether biological or mechanical, had points where small amounts of force applied in exactly the right way could create much larger effects. The quantum shackles were no different. They had been designed to distribute stress evenly, but that very design created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Joseph found the first pressure point where the energy field was anchored to the physical restraint. By applying steady pressure with his thumb while remaining completely still otherwise, he could create microfractures in the field generator without triggering the pain response. It was incredibly slow work that required perfect control, but it was possible. Hours passed as Joseph worked on the first shackle. Each microfracture had to be carefully created without alerting the monitoring systems that tracked the restraint's condition. He used breathing techniques to manage the pain when he occasionally triggered the shock response, turning each jolt of electricity into information about the system's sensitivity levels. Maria's medical reports were becoming more urgent. Lisa was losing consciousness for longer periods, and the bleeding was not stopping on its own. The baby was healthy but would need food soon, and Lisa was in no condition to provide it. Time was running out for both mother and child, and Joseph was their only hope for survival. The first shackle finally gave way just as the prison's artificial dawn began to lighten the corridors. Joseph felt the energy field collapse with a sensation like a weight being lifted from his soul. His right hand was free, but he still had 3 more restraints to deal with, and the guards would be making their morning rounds soon. With one hand free, Joseph could work more efficiently on the remaining shackles. He used his knowledge of leverage and pressure points to attack multiple stress fractures simultaneously. The pain was incredible when he accidentally triggered the shock response, but he had learned to use that agony as fuel for his determination, rather than letting it weaken his resolve. The second shackle broke just as Joseph heard the sound of guards beginning their shift change. He had perhaps 30 minutes before someone would check on the maximum security cells, and he still had 2 restraints holding him. But now he could feel victory within reach, and the knowledge that a mother and child were counting on him gave him strength beyond anything he had ever experienced. Joseph's ancestors had fought against impossible odds to protect their people and their way of life. They had faced cavalry charges with only bows and arrows, survived forced marches across desert wastelands, and maintained their dignity in the face of overwhelming force. Now it was his turn to prove that the Apache spirit could not be broken by any prison or any alien technology. The third shackle proved more difficult because it was positioned where Joseph could not get proper leverage. He had to contort his body in ways that sent fire through his joints while maintaining the precise control needed to create the microfractures. Sweat poured down his face as he worked, but his hands remained steady and his breathing stayed controlled. As the morning light grew stronger, Joseph could hear the sounds of the prison coming to life around him. Guards were shouting orders, prisoners were being marched to their work assignments, and somewhere below him, a baby was crying for her mother, who might not live to see another sunrise. The thought of that innocent child growing up without ever Knowing her mother's love filled Joseph with a rage that he channeled into breaking the final restraints that held him. The last shackle cracked just as the first guard boots echoed in the maximum security corridor. Joseph was free, but now the real challenge began. He had to reach Lisa's cell 3 levels down through a prison filled with guards and security systems, while carrying nothing but his knowledge and his determination to save 2 lives that meant everything to the future of humanity. Joseph dropped silently into the corridor outside Lisa's cell and immediately saw the extent of the crisis. Through the transparent aluminum window, he could see Lisa lying motionless on her thin mattress with Amy nestled against her chest. The pool of blood beneath the young mother had grown larger since his last update from Maria, and her skin had taken on the pale color that meant she was running out of time. The energy barrier that sealed Lisa's cell was different from the quantum shackles Joseph had destroyed. This system was designed for containment rather than punishment, which meant it operated on different principles and had different vulnerabilities. Joseph pressed his hand against the control panel and felt the vibrations of the generator that powered the barrier field. In the distance, alarms were still blaring as guards searched the maximum security section for any sign of how Joseph had escaped. Their confusion was buying him precious time, but he knew that eventually they would expand their search to include the general population areas. He had perhaps 10 minutes before the corridor would be crawling with armed Zephyrians. The control panel was protected by an access code that changed every hour, according to a pattern that Joseph had been studying for months. The guards were lazy about security in the general population section because they believed the energy barriers made escape impossible. They used the same basic sequence with small variations that followed the prison's daily schedule. Joseph's fingers flew over the control panel as he tried different combinations of the base code. His training with the Resistance had included classes on alien technology and security systems, and he had always been good at finding patterns in seemingly random data. The third combination he tried caused the barrier to flicker briefly before stabilizing again. Amy's crying was getting weaker, which told Joseph that the baby was becoming dehydrated and exhausted. Newborns needed regular feeding and care that Lisa was unable to provide in her current condition. If he could not get to them soon, he would be trying to save 1 life instead of 2, and the thought of that tiny child dying filled him with desperate urgency. The breakthrough came when Joseph realized that the Zephyrians had programmed the access codes to follow their own cultural patterns, rather than human ones. Their civilization was based on numerical sequences that reflected their religious beliefs about cosmic harmony. Once he understood the underlying philosophy, the code became predictable. The energy barrier dissolved with a soft humming sound that was almost lost in the noise of the distant alarms. Joseph stepped into the cell and knelt beside Lisa, checking her pulse and breathing while keeping one eye on the corridor outside. Her heartbeat was rapid and weak, and her breathing was shallow. She had lost a dangerous amount of blood and was sliding toward unconsciousness. Amy opened her eyes and looked up at Joseph with the clear gaze of a newborn who had not yet learned to fear the world. Despite everything that had happened, she was a healthy baby who would grow up strong if she was given the chance. Joseph felt a fierce protective instinct that reminded him of everything his grandfather had taught him about the warrior's duty to defend the innocent. Joseph had learned basic field medicine during his time with the Resistance, including emergency treatment for severe bleeding. He knew that Lisa was suffering from postpartum hemorrhage, and that her survival depended on stopping the blood loss and replacing the fluids she had already lost. The prison's medical supplies were 3 levels away, but he would have to work with whatever he could find in the immediate area. The first priority was to elevate Lisa's legs and apply pressure to the bleeding sites. Joseph used strips torn from his own prison uniform to create pressure bandages, while whispering reassurances that he hoped Lisa could hear even in her weakened state. Her eyelids fluttered as he worked, and she seemed to be trying to focus on his face. Through the communication network that connected the human prisoners, word was spreading that someone was actually trying to help Lisa. Other inmates began creating distractions to draw guard attention away from her cell block. They started fights in the workshops, triggered false alarms in the dining areas, and generally made as much noise as possible to mask any sounds coming from Joseph's rescue attempt. Joseph found a water container in Lisa's cell and used it to clean the worst of the bleeding, while checking for torn tissue that might need immediate repair. His grandfather had taught him traditional healing techniques that the Apache had used for generations, including ways to use pressure points to control internal bleeding. Modern medicine was better, but ancient wisdom could still save lives when nothing else was available. Amy had stopped crying and was watching Joseph with the intense focus that babies sometimes showed when something important was happening around them. Joseph spoke to her in the Apache language, telling her that she was going to be safe and that her mother was a warrior who would not give up without a fight. The sound of his voice seemed to calm the baby, and she made small, contented noises in response. The pressure bandages were slowing the bleeding, but Lisa needed fluids and nutrients that Joseph could not provide in the cell. He would have to find a way to get her to the medical wing where Maria Santos was waiting with more sophisticated supplies. The problem was that moving Lisa in her current condition could kill her just as surely as leaving her where she was. Joseph made the decision to risk everything on a desperate plan. He would carry Lisa and Amy through the maintenance tunnels to the medical wing while the other prisoners continued their distractions. It was incredibly dangerous because Lisa could bleed to death during the journey, but staying in the cell meant certain death for both mother and child. The sound of approaching boots in the corridor told Joseph that his time was almost up. The guards had finished their search of the maximum security section and were now expanding their hunt to the rest of the prison. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached Lisa's cell block, and after that his rescue mission would become a fighting retreat with no hope of success. Joseph gathered Lisa in his arms as gently as possible, while Amy continued to rest against her mother's chest. Lisa's eyes opened and she looked at him with confusion and hope. She tried to speak but could only manage a whisper that sounded like a question. Joseph told her that he was going to get her help and that everything would be all right. The maintenance tunnel access was in a utility closet at the end of the corridor. Joseph moved as quickly as he dared while trying not to jar Lisa or cause additional bleeding. Amy seemed to understand that something important was happening and remained quiet during the short journey. Behind them, the sound of boots was getting closer as the guards approached the cell block. Joseph reached the utility closet just as the first Zephyrian guard appeared at the far end of the corridor. The alien was moving slowly and checking each cell as he passed, which gave Joseph the few seconds he needed to open the tunnel access and slip inside with his precious cargo. The tunnel was even more cramped with 3 people, but it was their only hope of reaching safety. As Joseph began the careful journey through the maintenance system toward the medical wing, he could hear the guard discovering Lisa's empty cell. The alien's shouts of alarm echoed through the tunnels as more guards converged on the area, but Joseph was already moving toward Maria Santos and the medical supplies that could save 2 lives if he could just get there in time. The rescue mission had succeeded in its first phase, but now came the most dangerous part. Joseph had to keep Lisa and Amy alive while navigating through a prison that was rapidly filling with armed guards who had orders to recapture him at any cost. The Apache warrior who had broken the unbreakable chains was about to discover whether his courage and determination were enough to cheat death itself. The maintenance tunnel that led to the medical wing was barely wide enough for Joseph to crawl through while carrying Lisa and Amy. Every few feet he had to stop and check Lisa's condition, making sure the movement through the cramped space was not causing additional bleeding. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, and Amy continued to rest peacefully against her mother's chest as if she understood that staying quiet was essential for their survival. Behind them, the sound of guards flooding Lisa's cell block echoed through the ventilation system. Joseph could hear the Zephyrians shouting in their own language as they tried to understand how a maximum security prisoner had not only escaped his quantum shackles, but had also somehow penetrated the general population area. Their confusion was still buying time, but Joseph knew that confusion would soon turn to organized fury. The tunnel system was more complex than Joseph had realized from his earlier reconnaissance. Several passages branched off in different directions, and some were blocked by equipment or debris that forced him to find alternate routes. Each detour cost precious minutes and increased the risk that Lisa would lose consciousness permanently before he could get her to Maria Santos. Halfway to the medical wing, Joseph encountered his most serious obstacle yet. A section of the tunnel had partially collapsed, leaving only a narrow gap that might be too small for him to pass through while carrying both Lisa and Amy. The alternative route would add at least 20 minutes to their journey, time that Lisa probably did not have. Joseph examined the gap carefully and realized that he could squeeze through if he was willing to risk everything on a single desperate maneuver. He would have to push Lisa and Amy through the opening first, then follow immediately behind them before the unstable debris could shift and trap them all. The slightest miscalculation would bury them alive in the bowels of the alien prison. The decision came down to a choice between certain death and probable death, which was no choice at all for a warrior. Joseph positioned Lisa and Amy as carefully as possible and began to ease them through the narrow opening. Rocks and metal fragments scraped against his arms as he guided the unconscious mother and sleeping baby toward safety on the other side of the collapse. As Joseph squeezed through the gap himself, a piece of debris shifted and nearly pinned his leg against the tunnel wall. He twisted desperately and felt something tear in his shoulder, but he managed to pull free just as more rocks tumbled down to block the passage completely. They were through, but now there was no going back even if they wanted to. The medical wing was still 2 levels down, and Joseph could feel his strength beginning to fade from hours of continuous stress and exertion. His shoulder was bleeding from the injury in the tunnel, and his muscles were cramping from the awkward positions he had been forced to maintain. But Lisa's pulse was still beating against his palm, and Amy's tiny chest continued to rise and fall with each breath. The sound of drilling equipment told Joseph that the guards had found the blocked tunnel and were trying to clear it. The Zephyrians had construction crews on standby for exactly this type of situation, and they would break through the debris within an hour. But an hour might be enough if Joseph could reach Maria Santos and get the medical help that Lisa desperately needed. 3 levels above them, the other human prisoners were still maintaining their coordinated distraction. Fights had broken out in the dining hall and workshop areas, keeping most of the guards busy with crowd control instead of searching for Joseph. Captain Rodriguez was leading a particularly vocal protest in the maximum security section, demanding to know what had happened to his fellow prisoner. The tunnel opened into a utility room near the medical wing, and Joseph could finally stand upright for the first time in over an hour. Lisa was still unconscious but seemed to be breathing more easily, while Amy had woken up and was looking around with the bright curiosity of a healthy newborn. The sight of those alert baby eyes gave Joseph hope that his desperate journey was not in vain. Maria Santos was waiting in the medical storage room with supplies she had been gathering ever since word reached her about Joseph's escape attempt. She had torn sheets into sterile bandages, mixed solutions for fluid replacement, and prepared the basic surgical tools that were available in the prison's limited medical inventory. Her face showed both relief and terror when Joseph appeared, with Lisa and Amy. The medical examination confirmed Joseph's worst fears. Lisa had lost a dangerous amount of blood and was showing signs of shock that could lead to organ failure if not treated immediately. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, and her body temperature had dropped several degrees below normal. Without a proper blood transfusion, she would not survive much longer. Maria worked quickly to start an intravenous line using tubing salvaged from various medical devices. The prison did not stock blood for transfusions, but she had prepared a saline solution that would help maintain Lisa's blood volume until her body could begin producing new red blood cells. It was far from ideal treatment, but it was the best they could do with available resources. Amy needed attention too, though. Her problems were less immediately life-threatening. She was dehydrated and hungry, and her tiny body was beginning to show signs of stress from the traumatic circumstances of her birth. Maria mixed a basic formula using nutrients from the prison kitchen, while Joseph held the baby and whispered Apache lullabies that his grandmother had sung to him as a child. The sound of explosions echoing through the prison told them that the guards had started using heavier equipment to clear the blocked tunnel. The Zephyrians were becoming desperate to recapture Joseph before news of his escape could spread to other facilities and inspire additional prisoner rebellions. The aliens knew that the story of someone breaking quantum shackles could undermine their entire security system. Joseph made the hardest decision of his life. He would have to leave Lisa and Amy in Maria's care while he created a diversion that would draw the guards away from the medical wing. It was the only way to buy enough time for Lisa to stabilize and recover from her immediate crisis. But it also meant facing capture or death, while the two people he had risked everything to save remained vulnerable. Maria understood what Joseph was planning without him having to explain. She had seen that same look in the eyes of other resistance fighters who had chosen to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. She took Amy from his arms and promised that she would protect both mother and child with her own life if necessary. Lisa's eyes fluttered open as Joseph prepared to leave, and she managed to focus on his face for the first time since he had found her in the cell. She could not speak, but her expression showed gratitude and understanding. She knew that this stranger had risked everything to save her and her daughter, and that knowledge would give her the strength to fight for her own recovery. Joseph touched Amy's tiny hand one last time and made a silent promise that she would grow up free and strong. Then he turned away from the medical wing and began moving toward the area where the guards were concentrating their search. He would give Lisa and Amy the time they needed to survive, even if it cost him everything he had left to give. The Apache warrior who had broken chains that were supposed to be unbreakable was about to discover whether his courage was great enough to face the ultimate test. Behind him, a mother fought for her life while her newborn daughter slept peacefully in the arms of a woman who understood that some things were worth dying for. The rescue mission had become something larger than any of them had imagined, a symbol of human determination that would echo through the galaxy long after the prison walls had crumbled to dust. Joseph emerged from the maintenance tunnels into the main corridor of the prison's industrial section, where the sound of heavy machinery normally drowned out all other noise. Now the area was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the distant shouts of guards and the echo of boots on stone floors. The Zephyrians had shut down all work operations to focus their entire security force on finding the escaped prisoner who had done the impossible. The industrial section was Joseph's best choice for making a stand, because it offered multiple levels and hiding places where he could force the guards to split their attention. The heavy equipment and storage areas would provide cover, while he implemented the plan that had been forming in his mind since he left the medical wing. He was no longer trying to escape the prison, but rather to ensure that Lisa and Amy had enough time to recover and survive. Through the prison's communication network, Joseph could hear that word of his escape had spread throughout the facility. Human prisoners in every section were talking about the Apache warrior who had broken quantum shackles with his bare hands and rescued a mother and child from certain death. The story was growing with each telling, and the guards were becoming increasingly frustrated as their prisoners looked at them with new defiance. Captain Rodriguez had managed to organize a coordinated response from the maximum security section. Despite being confined to their cells, the resistance leaders were passing tactical information and encouragement to Joseph through the tap code system. They could not physically help him, but their strategic knowledge was proving invaluable as he prepared for what might be his final battle. The first group of Zephyrian guards entered the industrial section with their weapons drawn, and their postures showing the nervous aggression of soldiers who had been embarrassed by an enemy they had underestimated. Joseph watched them from his position behind a massive ore processor, counting their numbers and observing their search patterns. They were being methodical but predictable, exactly what he had hoped for. Joseph's plan was based on the guerrilla tactics that the Apache had used against the United States Army more than a century ago. He would use the environment to his advantage, strike quickly from unexpected angles, and then disappear before the enemy could respond effectively. The goal was not to win a conventional battle, but to create enough chaos and confusion to keep the guards busy for as long as possible. The first strike came when the lead guard moved past Joseph's hiding place. The Apache warrior emerged silently from behind the ore processor and disabled the alien with a chokehold that cut off blood flow to the brain without causing permanent damage. Joseph had no desire to kill unless absolutely necessary, but he would do whatever was required to protect Lisa and Amy. The unconscious guard's weapon was a Zephyrian plasma rifle that Joseph had studied during his months of observation. The Resistance had captured similar weapons during the War for Earth, and Joseph knew how to operate the basic functions. More importantly, he knew how to disable the tracking systems that would allow other guards to locate him. Joseph moved through the industrial section like a shadow, using maintenance passages and equipment installations to stay ahead of the search teams. Each time the guards thought they had cornered him, he would appear somewhere else entirely and strike at their flanks before vanishing again. The Zephyrians were becoming increasingly frustrated as their superior numbers and technology failed to trap a single human prisoner. The sound of Amy crying in the distance told Joseph that the baby was awake and probably hungry. The cry was faint but carried clearly through the prison's stone corridors, and it reminded him of everything he was fighting for. That tiny voice represented the future of humanity, and the hope that someday children would be born free, instead of in alien prisons. Maria Santos was doing everything possible to keep both Lisa and Amy stable, but she was working with limited supplies and no backup if something went wrong. Lisa was responding to the intravenous fluids and had regained consciousness for brief periods, but she was still dangerously weak from blood loss. Amy needed regular feeding and care that Maria was providing, while trying to remain hidden from the guards. The battle in the industrial section intensified as more guards poured into the area. Joseph found himself surrounded on 3 sides and had to use an old Apache trick that his grandfather had taught him. He created multiple false trails using pieces of his torn clothing and traces of his scent, then moved through areas where the guards would not expect to find him. The Zephyrians brought in tracking equipment that could detect human bioelectric fields, but Joseph countered by using the prison's power systems to create electromagnetic interference. He had learned about alien technology during his time with the Resistance, and now that knowledge was keeping him alive in a deadly game of cat and mouse through the prison's maze-like corridors. 2 hours into the battle, Joseph received an unexpected message through the communication network. A human resistance ship had detected the distress signal that had been broadcasting from the prison since his escape began. Captain Sarah Mitchell of the destroyer Phoenix was leading a rescue operation that would arrive within 6 hours if Joseph could continue to hold out. The news gave Joseph new strength and determination. His mission was no longer just about buying time for Lisa and Amy to recover, but about keeping them alive until rescue could arrive. The Phoenix was one of the most advanced ships in the human fleet, with the firepower and technology needed to break through the prison's defenses and extract the prisoners. Joseph's hit-and-run tactics were taking their toll on the Zephyrian guards. Several had been injured in encounters with the Apache warrior, and their morale was dropping as they realized that their prisoner was far more dangerous than they had been led to believe. The guards had been trained to handle typical escape attempts, not to fight a guerrilla war against someone who combined ancient wisdom with modern military training. The prison's warden finally arrived in the industrial section with reinforcements and heavy weapons. Commander Vex was a career military officer who had built his reputation on maintaining order in the most difficult facilities. He was furious that a single human prisoner had embarrassed his entire security force and was determined to end the situation before his superiors learned of the security breach. Joseph could see the warden's shuttle landing in the prison courtyard and knew that the final phase of the battle was about to begin. Vex would bring military-grade equipment and tactics that would be much harder to counter than the standard prison guards. But the Apache warrior was ready for whatever came next, knowing that every minute he held out brought rescue closer for the mother and child he had sworn to protect. The communication network carried a final message from Maria Santos. Lisa was stable and Amy was healthy, but they would need at least 4 more hours before they could be safely moved. Joseph looked out at the courtyard where armed Zephyrians were unloading assault equipment and made his choice. He would hold the industrial section for as long as humanly possible, and then he would find a way to hold it longer than that. The story of the Apache warrior who broke unbreakable chains was about to reach its climax in a battle that would prove once again that the human spirit could triumph over any odds when fighting for something worth dying for. The Phoenix dropped out of hyperspace with the fury of a star being born. Captain Sarah Mitchell had pushed her ship and crew beyond their limits to reach the prison planet in time, and now the destroyer's weapons were painting targeting solutions. On every Zephyrian installation within 100 kilometers, the rescue operation had become a full military assault when long-range sensors detected the massive security response surrounding the facility. Joseph heard the thunder of spacecraft engines overhead and knew that help had finally arrived. He had been fighting for 8 hours straight in the industrial section, using every trick and tactic his grandfather had ever taught him to stay ahead of Commander Vex and his increasingly desperate security forces. The Apache warrior was exhausted and wounded, but his spirit remained unbroken as the sound of human weapons echoed across the alien landscape. The Phoenix's assault shuttles came down like mechanical eagles, their pilots weaving between defensive fire while Marine assault teams prepared for combat drops directly into the prison compound. Captain Mitchell had studied the facility's layout during the approach and identified the medical wing where intelligence suggested the rescued prisoners were hiding. The mission was to extract Lisa, Amy, and Joseph before the Zephyrians could execute them as an example to other potential escapees. Commander Vex realized that his worst nightmare was coming true. The story of a human prisoner breaking quantum shackles and rescuing a mother and child was exactly the kind of propaganda that could inspire rebellions throughout the Zephyrian Consortium's prison system. If Joseph Running Bear escaped to tell his tale, it would undermine alien authority on dozens of worlds and cost Vex his career, or possibly his life. The first assault shuttle touched down in the prison courtyard just as Joseph made his final stand in the ore processing facility. He had rigged the industrial machinery to create a series of explosions that would bring down half the building if the guards tried to storm his position. The threat of massive structural damage was the only thing keeping the Zephyrians at bay, while rescue forces fought their way through the outer defenses. Maria Santos heard the sound of human voices shouting orders in English and knew that the impossible was actually happening. She gathered Lisa and Amy in her arms and began moving toward the extraction point that had been broadcast on emergency frequencies. Lisa was weak but conscious, and Amy seemed to sense that something important was changing in their environment. The battle for the prison reached its peak when human Marines encountered Zephyrian guards in the main corridors. The aliens had superior numbers and defensive positions, but the humans fought with a ferocity that shocked their enemies. Every Marine knew the story of the Apache warrior, who had risked everything to save an innocent mother and child, and they were determined to prove worthy of that example. Joseph's position in the industrial section became the focal point of the entire battle. Commander Vex had concentrated his forces around the ore processing facility, determined to capture or kill the escaped prisoner before rescue could arrive. But Joseph had turned the building into a fortress using his knowledge of explosives and structural engineering, and every Zephyrian advance met with devastating resistance. The breakthrough came when Captain Rodriguez and the other resistance leaders in maximum security managed to overload their cell's power systems and create a mass breakout. Dozens of experienced fighters poured into the prison corridors, adding their strength to the rescue operation while settling old scores with their captors. The coordinated uprising caught the guards completely off guard and split their attention at the worst possible moment. Joseph heard the distinctive sound of quantum shackles being destroyed throughout the maximum security section and knew that his fellow prisoners had finally found their own path to freedom. The knowledge that he was no longer fighting alone gave him new strength as he prepared for the final confrontation with Commander Vex and his remaining forces. The Zephyrian commander made his last desperate move by threatening to execute human prisoners unless Joseph surrendered immediately. But the Apache warrior had learned from his grandfather that some threats were nothing more than the noise made by defeated enemies. Joseph responded by triggering a controlled explosion that brought down a section of the prison wall and opened a direct path for the rescue forces. Captain Mitchell herself led the final assault team that reached the medical wing, where Maria Santos was protecting Lisa and Amy. The sight of the newborn baby sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around her touched something deep in the hardened military officer's heart. This was what they were really fighting for, not territory or resources, but the right of innocent children to grow up free. The extraction of Lisa, Amy, and Maria went smoothly despite continued resistance from Zephyrian forces. The Phoenix's medical team immediately began advanced treatment for Lisa's condition, while Amy was placed in a specialized newborn care unit that had been prepared during the journey. Both mother and child would make full recoveries under proper medical supervision. Joseph's extraction proved more difficult because he refused to leave until every human prisoner who wanted to escape had been given the chance. The Apache warrior had started a revolution that was spreading beyond the prison to the planet's mining colonies, and even to other worlds in the Zephyrian system. His example had shown that the aliens were not invincible, and that human courage could overcome any obstacle. The final battle ended when Commander Vex was captured trying to escape in a shuttle loaded with stolen prisoner records. The Zephyrian officer would later be tried for war crimes, but his fate was less important than the symbolic victory that Joseph Running Bear had achieved. The quantum shackles that had been considered unbreakable were now scrap metal, and the story of their destruction would spread throughout the galaxy. Years later, Amy Running Bear Santos graduated from the Earth Military Academy with honors and became a starship captain in her own right. She had grown up knowing that her life had been saved by an Apache warrior who had risked everything for strangers, and she dedicated her career to protecting others who could not protect themselves. Her mother, Lisa, became a leading advocate for prisoner rights and worked to ensure that no one would ever again face childbirth in an alien cell. Joseph Running Bear became a legend among both humans and aliens, though he always insisted that he had done nothing more than follow the teachings of his grandfather. The Apache Nation honored him as a warrior who had upheld the oldest traditions while facing the newest challenges. His story was taught in schools throughout human space as an example of what one person could accomplish when fighting for what was right. The prison on Kepler 442b was eventually converted into a memorial for all those who had suffered under alien occupation. A statue of Joseph Running Bear breaking his shackles stood in the courtyard where Commander Vex had once planned his final assault. Children from across the galaxy came to see the place where a single act of courage had changed the course of history. Maria Santos retired from medicine but continued to serve as a consultant for rescue operations throughout the frontier. She never forgot the night when she had helped deliver a baby in the bowels of an alien prison, and then watched an Apache warrior risk his life to save them both. The experience had taught her that healing sometimes required more than medical knowledge and that the greatest medicine was hope itself. The quantum shackles were never used again after news of Joseph's escape spread throughout the Zephyrian consortium. The aliens developed new restraint technologies, but none carried the psychological impact of the supposedly unbreakable bonds that had been shattered by human determination. The failure of their most advanced security system marked the beginning of the end for alien domination of human space. Captain Sarah Mitchell went on to command the first human deep space exploration fleet, carrying the message of freedom to worlds that had never seen a human face. She always carried a photo of Amy Running Bear Santos as a reminder that the most important victories were often won, not through superior firepower, but through the willingness to risk everything for those who could not fight for themselves. The story became a cornerstone of human diplomacy with other species, proving that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their weapons, but their capacity for sacrifice and compassion. Even former enemies came to respect the tale of the Apache warrior who had broken chains that could not be broken and saved lives that could not be saved. It was a story that defined what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of wonders and terrors, and it would be told for as long as humans traveled among the stars.